Okay, so the key to solving this economics equation, first of all, is to note a particular equality that is used in economics quite frequently, which is the fact that marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Basically, the idea of this is the marginal cost for a company is if you have one additional unit you're going to produce, this is how much it costs. And if you have one additional unit you are going to produce, this is how much revenue you take in. So you want to produce until they equal one another. If the marginal cost exceeds the marginal revenue and you produce too much, then you are no longer turning a profit. Okay, so let's start with the equation. So they gave us a demand function right here, which is price is equal to 300 minus 5Q. Now this is very important to set up the problem first of all. So let's start with our axes. So we start with the 300 on our price axes here. So basically if on our quantity axes, if Q is equal to 0, then you can solve this equation and P is equal to 300. So that's how we know the cross section. Okay, and then typically it goes all the way down to Q, and we know if P is equal to 0, then Q is equal to 60. Okay, so that is our demand curve, and it's basically representative of this equation. All right, now instead of demand curve, we also want to look at our marginal revenue curve. Since we're monopolists, we don't have to simply follow the demand curve. We can do what we want since we own the market. Okay, so this is marginal revenue, and it's represented by this equation. MR is equal to 300 minus 10Q. Okay, now that is this equation. Again, we have 300 in our price intercept. However, it doesn't quite intersect at 60. So basically how we solve this again is if we set MR to 0, then Q here has to equal 30. So basically intersects at 30. All right, so that gives us our two slopes that we are looking at, the marginal revenue slope and the demand slope. This represents what the monopolist is looking at, and this demand slope represents what the market is looking at. Okay, so next let's figure out how we're going to solve this problem. Again, we go back to this identity. It's very useful and extremely important. We have our two equations here. So marginal cost is equal to 100, and that is equal to marginal revenue, which is equal to 300 minus 10Q. Okay, so now that we have that, we can simply solve it for Q. And this is what our monopolist, this is the quantity that our monopolist decides to produce at. Okay, so let's say equals 300 minus 100 is 200, and we flip this onto the other side. And 10Q over here, this term goes down here for 10Q, and then we solve Q is equal to 20. Okay, so fairly straightforward solving that algebraically, but let's look at it graphically. So in addition to these two graphs, we can take a look at, well, what happens if the monopolist doesn't produce a quantity of 30, but he in fact produces a quantity of 20, which is what the equation says he ought to be doing. All right, so if he is producing a quantity of 20, then we set Q to 20 here, and we know on the other side marginal cost is 100. So this here is our marginal cost, and it's 100. So this is the amount that the monopolist is spending to produce these 20 goods, 100. It's simply given to us as a static equation, so we'll just take it at that. However, when we look at the demand curve, there's quite a bit of demand if the monopolist is only producing 20 goods. All right, so we go up to the demand curve, and let's move it over. And then at 20 goods, the demand is a little bit higher than simply 100. So the people in the market are willing to pay a lot more. And the way we solve for it is we simply solve this equation. So price in the market is equal to 300 minus 5 times quantity of 20. So that's 300 minus 100, which is equal to 200. Okay, so the price on the market is 200, which you can see lines up perfectly at this point. All right, so graphically, this represents the amount of money that the monopolist takes in. These are his costs. However, this part of the graph represents his profit, right? Because he's only spending 100, but per unit, but he's taking in 200 per unit. All right, so in economics, we use this term pi to represent profit. So let's calculate out what profit is. Well, it's simply the difference between, it's simply this area, which is equal to, as you can see on this bottom axis, 20 units, or Q, times the difference between the price times the price minus cost, right? So 20, it's very intuitive. It's the quantity times the difference between the price and the cost, which in this case, we already solved for as 200 minus 100. And so the profit at the end of the day that he takes home is 20 times 100, or 2,000.